So here are some pictures of Androscoggin Lake in October. So the two on the right are from the boat launch, the public boat launch on Route 133. Those are on October 15th. And then the one on the left is a Secchi disc being lowered at the deep spot where we monitor the lake. So very green. And then a couple more, and this, this one on the right, the same day that those on the boat launch were taken, but this one on the right, I feel like really really kind of makes the point. Like, it's very green water, certainly more greener water than we have seen in a long time on Androscoggin Lake or on any of the lakes in the 30 Mile River Watershed. So just a little bit of the timeline here. So in early June, 30 Mile, as Buddy said, in partnership with ALIC, began doing water quality monitoring on the lake bi-weekly. So we're going out twice a month and we're collecting data on clarity, temperature, dissolved oxygen, phosphorus, and chlorophyll A. In August, we were noticing and reporting.
Lidie, can I just jump in real quickly?
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but when we began partnering this past June, don't assume that this is the first year that we've been doing water quality monitoring in the lake. This is the first year that ALIC has partnered with 30 Mile. Although 30 Mile has helped us out with some water quality testing in the past, we have been doing water quality monitoring on Androscoggin Lake for I believe around 30 years. So
there's data going back to the 70s. I didn't mean to imply that. I was just giving the timeline for this summer, but
okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And so in August, we noticed reduced water clarity readings, and in September, there was enough decline in water clarity that we ramped things up and began monitoring weekly. By September 29th, the clarity had dropped below 2 meters, and that's the threshold where then the DEP considers that an official lake-wide bloom. So while prior to that, even earlier in August, there were areas of the lake that were looking green or had clarity less than that. For it to be a lake-wide bloom, we're monitoring this at that one station, the deep spot of the lake. So that was the date. So we were collecting water samples in September and October and getting those to the DEP and to the EPA so that they could test those for the type of algae. So water clarity, I mentioned a minute ago, what is that and how do we measure that? So using the Secchi disc and a scope, we're lowering this disc down to see just how far we can see the disc before it disappears. And the photo there on the left shows you, like the picture there, or in the right on that box is the algae. So the clarity is giving us a really simple, low-cost measurement of how much algae there is. As far as the phosphorus goes, so phosphorus is a naturally occurring, nutrient element that's in the lake. It's needed for plant growth. It's good to have it in small amounts. When you have too much of it, you can get algal blooms because the phosphorus feeds the algae. Here's a chart that shows both our phosphorus levels and the Secchi disc readings from throughout the season. So the red dashed line at the top there is at 2 meters. So if you think of the very top there is the surface of the lake, you go down 2 meters. If you can only see 2 meters, then that's an algal bloom. And then if the Secchi disc, you can still see it deeper than that, then your clarity is better. So on the right side, you can see all those Secchi discs clustered around the red line or a little bit above the red line. So that's what I was talking about earlier, where the clarity was declining, but it wasn't technically an algal bloom until later in September. And then our phosphorus readings are the yellow dots. So if you have a phosphorus reading below 10 parts per billion, that's generally that's a good reading. algal blooms typically on lakes in Maine are happening around 20 parts per billion phosphorus. Some lakes can bloom less than that, but that's, kind of average. So those phosphorus readings you can see are like coinciding with the Secchi discs, right? They're kind of following that same curve up there. So we have higher phosphorus readings at the same time that we're having those lower Secchi disc readings. And here's a chart that shows the precipitation along with our Secchi disc readings. So we had a lot of big spikes in precipitation. It was a wet July and August and, later on. So we're getting some big spikes of precipitation, and they're you can see how they're correlating with the Secchi disc readings as well. So as far as what is this algae that's causing the bloom, Dick and Patty Windecker, who I think were on the, I saw them on the call here earlier, sent us these photos that they got with their microscope of the algae that's in there, and we've sent our samples to the DEP, and they confirmed the species of the cyanobacteria that we have in the lake, and they're not. I want to say they're not invasive. They're naturally, in lakes. They're in Pocasset Lake. They're in most lakes. But the problem is when things get out of balance, when there's too much phosphorus and you get too much of this cyanobacteria. So it can have a big impact. Like, obviously, it's an impact on recreation and the aesthetic value. People don't want to go out and boat or swim or fish or do any of that. And the algae can be toxic. We haven't received any information from the EPA or DEP on the toxicity of this algae from the samples that we sent, but it is potentially toxic. Not all blooms are toxic, but if the water's green, you should not go in it. It's not safe. And generally, the places that are less safe tend to be, downwinds, these scums that are downwind when the algae can collect. So definitely keep children, pets, out of those scums. I've got some links here for some more information if you want to find out more about it, but it's not a safe thing. And for the town of Wayne, something for you all to just keep in mind is that when you have a decline in water clarity, water quality and water clarity, then you will likely have a decline eventually, in property values. So it's concerning for those reasons, for the aesthetic reasons, recreation, for safety, and for property values. Some things I wanted to talk about briefly about Androscoggin Lake and why some of the risk factors for Androscoggin Lake. So Androscoggin Lake has tended over the years to have a slightly higher level of phosphorus than other lakes in the area. Historically, around 15 parts per billion. It's unique in that the Dead River can backflow into the lake under certain conditions. As you probably all know, sometimes Androscoggin Lake flows into the river and other times the river flows into the lake. So depending on the water levels in the river and the lake. The chemistry in the sediment of Androscoggin Lake also puts it at higher risk for that phosphorus to be released from the sediment. It's called internal loading. So I don't have time to get into all the chemistry there, but that is another risk factor for Androscoggin Lake. There are, historically, there have been inputs of phosphorus, from the Androscoggin River, especially during, worse in the past, and now more during floods. Androscoggin has a large watershed with a lot, it's at the bottom of all of the lakes of the 30 Mile River Watershed. So it's downstream, so it gets impacts from both ends. It has had it did have a lake-wide bloom back in 1999, and it's had many years, in all the years that it's been monitored, it has had many years where it's had near bloom conditions. So where phosphorus levels and clarity levels were showing that it was close to blooming. So it's not, this isn't completely out of the blue, I guess is the point to make. There is some history there. So what's different about this summer, there were drought conditions. It was a very dry spring. Water levels were very low in the lake. And then there was warmer weather this summer, which was raising the temperature of the lake. And then with all the rain that we had, there were a lot of inputs, a lot of nutrients coming into the lake from the whole watershed and from the dead river. So a lot of things going on this summer that made it a different season. So
Lidie,
yeah.
Can I mention one other thing that I think could possibly have an impact that is certainly different this summer than has been in other summers in the past?
Yeah.
As many people know, the dam on the Dead River is primarily used to prevent backflow of water from the Androscoggin River into Androscoggin Lake. And very often spring flooding will cause a breach of the dam in the fall. The usual pattern that we also can use what are called panels to help restrict the outflow of water from the lake and to keep lake levels a little bit higher than they otherwise would be. Typically what we do is as soon as the water has back flushed out of the lake in the spring, in other words, the flood breaches the dam, that flood water, we allow it to leave the lake again. And then we put the panels in typically when lake levels approach a certain level. Usually it's around 270 or 269 feet above sea level when we put those panels back in. Then in the fall, we take the panels out at some point in order to allow the lake level to prepare for the spring floods again, because the panels have to be out in order for the water to flush back out of the lake after the potential flood. What was different this summer is that the panels were stolen, okay? And so we did not have panels to put in the dam in the spring. And so lake levels dropped fairly rapidly in the spring when we had very little rain, more than they normally would. And then we got the panels, but we purchased some more panels, or panels were donated, I guess. And the panels were put in. And while normally we use the panels to slow the outflow of water from the lake, this year we used the panels to raise the water in the lake because the water had already dropped. And now we're trying to get it back up a little bit. Okay. And so that too could have caused some changes in the inflow from the Dead River. As the rain came down, we could have had water washing in along the Dead River and then causing that to backflow into the lake as we're trying to raise the water level. So the way that we managed the water level using those panels this summer was very different than what we normally do. In addition, of course, to the weather patterns being the way that they were and everything else sort of, contributing and all the other things that were different this summer. So just wanted to mention that as something that was a bit different as well. Whether or not it contributed or not, I don't know, but that is certainly different.
Yeah, good. Thanks for adding that, Buddy. So next steps, and I will kind of like, I started off talking about this wasn't caused by the milfoil. Another question I've gotten is, why don't you go clean it up? So next step is not to go scoop up the algae. Like that's not something that we can do or would do or attempt to do. But there are some things that we have been thinking about because, as I said, we're very concerned about this. We're taking it very seriously. We being 30 Mile and ALIC, in partnership, we're working on this together. So next steps, we are talking about doing a watershed survey next spring. A watershed survey is something that's been done on Androscoggin Lake in the past, but not for about 20 years. And so it's a watershed survey is gives us a snapshot of the watershed on a day in time, and we train volunteers who go out along with technical leaders to document all of the erosion threats in the watershed. So we're looking for these sources of phosphorus and places that are places that could be a threat to water quality. So we're documenting that through watershed survey. So that's something that we would want to do anyway, but it is also something that we need to do in order to be eligible to apply for DEP funding the following year. So there's a program called the 319 grant program through the main DEP. It's funding that comes from the US EPA. And in order to be eligible for that, you need to have completed a watershed survey. So that funding we would apply for in the spring of 2023. And that funding would give us an opportunity to address bigger threats, to give us money to get on the ground and to fix things that are contributing phosphorus to the lake. Another step that we're thinking about is updating a watershed management plan. And there are various levels of watershed management plans, but we're looking at a plan that would involve a more in-depth study of the lake, because it is a really dynamic system. There's a lot going on with both being at the end of the chain, but on the dam and the Dead River. So we're looking at working on this plan after we've done the watershed survey, getting recommendations out there for what to do over a 10-year time frame in the lake. And we of course want to be continuing to monitor the water quality next year, and we're looking at expanding our capacity in-house in 30 Mile with some additional equipment so that we can do more in-depth monitoring of the bloom.